Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, you've brought us a really important topic, understanding crack cocaine use, and maybe more importantly, how professionals can, best work with the individuals affected by it.
Exactly. And our source for this is the book Crack Cocaine, The Open Door by Christopher Robin and Kenneth Jordan.
Right. So our mission today is to really dive deep, go beyond the usual stuff, and pull out those key insights from the book. Things that might actually shift how we think about engagement and, well, move past some of those common misconceptions.
Yeah, and what struck me right away, actually, was how the authors reflected on their own early training back in the 90s.
Oh, yeah. What about it?
Well, they said it was so heavily focused on the history and the pharmacology of crack cocaine.
Okay.
But they make this really sharp point that even now, a lot of the training hasn't really changed its focus. It doesn't prioritize like actual engagement with the person using the substance.
Okay, hang on. Let's unpack this because that raises a huge question, doesn't it? How can professionals really be effective if the training they get doesn't even center on understanding and connecting with the people they're supposed to be helping? It's kind of like getting the blueprints but never learning how to talk to the homeowners.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the book really hammers this home, the need for each professional to sort of scrutinize their own approach, their own feelings when it comes to this specific group.
So like hidden biases.
Yeah, or just discomfort. They suggest that these negative perceptions, even if you try to mask them with a, professional front, can seriously undermine the help you're trying to give.
Right. And that's where it gets really, really interesting because if those unspoken negative vibes are messing up the interaction, well, it kind of makes sense why positive outcomes might be harder to come by.
Exactly. And the authors suggest this might be why, compared to other areas of drug use where maybe there's a strong medication focus, like with opiates, there's this noticeable lack of really solid evidence for psychosocial interventions, like talking to therapies, when it comes to crack cocaine.
Huh. Which leads us, I guess, to some pretty fundamental questions the book throws out right at the start, questions that'll kind of guide us today.
Yeah, absolutely. They ask us to think about, well, what do we actually learned from service users' experiences over the last, 25 years?
Good question.
And what evidence really supports the methods we're using right now? And this is a big one. Why does it seem so much harder to prove that talking therapies work compared to, say, prescribing a pill?
Yeah, the quantifiable results versus the maybe fuzzier human change stuff.
Right. And the questions don't stop there.
Oh.
They also challenge this tendency to quickly slap mental health diagnoses on crack cocaine users. Is that always accurate, or is it sometimes a way to categorize, maybe even distance ourselves?
Yeah. Or like a box to put people in.
And they also dig into this common expectation of aggression and violence. Where does that idea come from? And crucially, how does expecting it actually shape how we respond, maybe even provoke it?
Wow. That really makes you think about self-fulfilling prophecies, doesn't it?
It does. And are crack cocaine users genuinely harder to treat than others? Or is that just a perception, a narrative that's kind of taken hold?
And why do so many people only get help once they're tangled up in the criminal justice system, often after years and years of use?
Yeah, that's a critical point. And finally, given how much we rely on meds for other dependencies, the book asks, is there actually a role for pharmacological interventions when crack cocaine is the primary issue?
So a really comprehensive set of challenges laid out there. It forces you to really examine the foundations.
But, and this is really fascinating, despite outlining all these, let's say, difficulties,
Yeah.
the authors put forward this really provocative core belief.
Go on.
They argue that primary crack cocaine users are often the easiest clients to work with.
Whoa, hang on. Easiest. That that definitely makes you pause, right? After everything you just said.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive.
So what's their thinking there?
Well, it's pretty direct, actually. They basically say the main obstacle isn't the service user, it's the practitioner.
Oof.
It's our own mindset, our approach, maybe our own baggage. The book is basically saying, hey, professionals, take a look in the mirror. Be open to growing.
Right. An invitation to self-reflect.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that stage set, Chapter 1 dives into the pharmacology, trying to clear up some basics.
Yeah, and they're really insistent on this point. Crack cocaine isn't some totally different substance from cocaine powder.
Okay.
It's just cocaine hydrochloride that's been processed, usually with ammonia or baking soda and heat, to remove the salt and make it smokable. That's it.
Okay. So chemically, it's the same basic thing.
Fundamentally, yes. And they stress, look, this doesn't minimize the impact of the drug at all, but understanding this basic fact is crucial. It helps dismantle this myth of crack as some uniquely demonic substance.
Gotcha. Less mystique, more chemistry.
Exactly. Then they talk about how it's used the route of administration, and this is key to the experience.
Smoking versus snorting, right?
Right. Smoking gets it into the bloodstream way faster because the lungs have this huge surface area, much bigger than your nasal passages.
Okay, so picture that. It hits the lungs, bam, absorbed instantly into the blood.
Straight to the brain via red blood cells. It's like an express delivery service.
And that's why you get that incredibly intense, immediate high that people talk about with crack.
Precisely. And to understand the longer-term effects, they touch on pharmacokinetics. Absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion.
Sounds technical.
It is a bit, but the point is, understanding how the body handles the drug helps you think about harm reduction. The speed and amount hitting the system are key to the intensity, but also the risk.
And getting rid of it, excretion, that's important too, right, if it builds up.
That's where toxicity comes in. And not just from the drug itself, but mixing it, like with alcohol, creates other harmful compounds like cocathylene.
So this isn't just abstract science for them.
Not at all. They use this understanding to suggest practical things, like encouraging users maybe to use smaller amounts or find ways to slow down that absorption, avoid those really rapid high concentrations in the blood.
Okay, practical application. Then they get into pharmacodynamics, the brain chemicals.
Yep, dopamine and serotonin primarily. We hear a lot about dopamine and cocaine.
The reward pathway thing.
Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, dopamine sends a signal between brain cells and then gets cleared away. Cocaine basically blocks that clearing away process.
Like jamming the cleanup crew.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So dopamine builds up in the gap, the synapse, and keeps stimulating the next neuron. That's the euphoria. The reward signal gets stuck on.
Ah, okay. And serotonin.
That regulates mood, aggression, sleep, appetite, lots of things. Crack use messes with serotonin function too, and that might even affect how intense later highs feel. It shows how interconnected it all is.
Right. And here's a really, really significant point they make, you mentioned.
At the time they wrote the book,
Yeah.
there was still no specific approved long-term medications for crack cocaine dependence, even though developing one was and is a priority for bodies like Indaya.
Wow. Okay, that is crucial.
It totally underscores why the psychosocial stuff, the talking therapies, the relationship building is so vital. If there's no magic pill, we have to focus on the psychological and social aspects.
Makes sense. Okay, so after laying out the science, the book takes aim at this common idea that users are experts on their own condition.
Yeah, this is really interesting. They kind of push back on that.
How so?
Their logic is, well, if users were truly the ultimate experts, they had all the answers, they probably wouldn't need professional help, right?
Good point.
They suggest maybe we as professionals haven't always put enough effort into deeply understanding the user's actual lived experience beyond the surface.
So it's a challenge to us. Again, maybe that expert label lets us off the hook from really digging deeper.
Could be. And they also challenge the idea that cocaine is primarily a physical drug. Yes, it has physical effects, like releasing adrenaline.
The fight or flight thing.
Right. But they argue it's fundamentally a psychological drug. They urge us to move beyond thinking about it purely through the lens of, say, alcohol or opiate withdrawal, which have very strong physical components.
So that adrenaline surge, the fight or flight, they see that as having more prolonged psychological fallout.
Exactly. They talk about the impact of being in that heightened adrenaline state for extended periods, way beyond normal stress, and the lasting psychological consequences.
Okay, so moving into chapter 2, they introduce this model, the Johari window.
Yes. It's a fantastic model for thinking about awareness, whose awareness, the clients, the professionals, even the services as a whole.
And it has 4 parts, 4 windows.
4 quadrants, yeah. Open, blind, closed, and hidden or unknown.
Okay, open sounds straightforward, stuff everyone knows.
Pretty much. Information, feelings, behaviors known to both the person and others. No secrets there.
But blind, that sounds intriguing.
That's the gold mine for professionals, really.
Yeah.
It's the stuff about the person, maybe their tone, body language, contradictions that they aren't aware of, but others can see, like us.
Ah, the things you notice that they don't.
Exactly. The book gives an example. The user talks about how hard giving up crack is, but they're slightly smiling. They don't realize it, but the counselor sees it.
Right. A subtle clue.
And the goal, the book says, is to help the client widen that open window, increase their self-awareness, The blind window is where we can ask really insightful questions based on those observations.
But understanding your own blind spots as a professional is key too, right? Because if you're not aware of your biases...
Absolutely. It can completely block your ability to connect and help effectively.
Okay, then the closed window. What's that?
That's the stuff the person knows about themselves, but deliberately keeps hidden from others. Secrets, basically. Often driven by fear, shame, guilt.
Makes sense. And the last one, hidden unknown.
That's the really deep stuff. Buried feelings, traumas, unconscious patterns that neither the person nor others are aware of.
Right. And the book warns about poking around in the closed or hidden windows without care.
Definitely. You need trust, supervision.
Yeah.
Messing with that can cause real emotional distress if not handled properly.
But the Johari window isn't just about the client, you said. It applies to the professional, too, and can clash.
Yes. We professionals have our own open, blind, closed, hidden aspects. And when our window interacts with the client's window, it creates this complex dynamic. They suggest it can lead to unspoken conflict, tension beneath the surface. Less about countertransference, maybe, and more about this interactive field.
Wow. Okay, so the relationship itself is shaped by these different layers of awareness.
And they take it even further. They apply the Johari window to the whole service.
The organization? How?
By looking at the service's culture, its history, how has it responded or failed to respond to certain groups? They use the example of how services historically struggled to effectively help crack cocaine users, suggesting the service itself had blind spots or closed areas.
So the service needs to do its own self-reflection, examine its practices, supervision, development, to widen its own open window.
Exactly. Become more aware and responsive.
And bringing it back to working with individuals, the Johari model is seen as a really practical tool for crack cocaine users.
Very much so.
Right.
It encourages us to be really receptive, ask good questions, especially ones that might illuminate those blind spots for the user. They even question that phrase, chaotic lifestyle.
Oh, yeah.
They say, well, what does chaotic actually mean for this person? Is there maybe some hidden investment in that chaos? Don't just label it, explore it.
Right. Always digging deeper. Okay, chapter 3 gets into resistance. That's a big one.
Huge. They use that fable, the frog and the scorpion.
Where the scorpion stings the frog even though they both drown because it's in its nature.
Yeah, illustrating that paradoxical pullback to harmful patterns. And they frame resistance not just as something the client does, but something that impacts the professional emotionally, too. They even link it to the stages of grief using the bereavement chart model.
That's interesting, like grieving the loss of the drug or the lifestyle.
Potentially, yeah. Or grieving the possibility of change. And a key example of resistance they give is the conforming service user.
The one who ticks all the boxes in treatment but relapses right after?
Exactly. It makes you think, are we sometimes just treating the surface compliance, not the deep-seated resistance?
Focusing too much on the opportunities for change, as they put it, and not enough on understanding the resistance itself.
Precisely.
Yep.
And they use the criminal justice system example, people conforming to get rewards or avoid punishment. But no real internal shift happens. That's a form of resistance, too.
Okay. And there are different ways to even think about resistance, different theories.
Right. They briefly mention psychodynamic, cognitive, behavioral, systemic views, just to show it's complex. There's no single right way to see it.
And they have a specific take on the goal of drug counseling for crack users.
Yeah, it's maybe a bit different. They suggest the aim is to get the user to a place where they can openly acknowledge the enjoyment they get from the high, the behaviors around it, keeping that relationship with the drug central, even if other issues are present.
Okay. Confronting the pleasure aspect directly.
And crucially, they remind us resistance isn't just the client's issue.
The worker or the service can resist change, too.
Absolutely. Resisting new ideas, new ways of working. They stress that team agreement, everyone being on the same page, is vital for good outcomes.
Right. Okay, chapter 4. Motivation. Another massive topic.
Huge. They start with basics.
Yeah.
Primary motivators, survival, sex, versus secondary ones, money image, and how those secondary ones can become incredibly powerful, sometimes overriding the basic. Think eating disorders or drug use itself.
Yeah. And they touch on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, punishment, stress.
Yeah.
Distinguishing good stress, eustress, from bad stress, distress.
Coercion, self-control, just laying some groundwork. But
Yeah.
the key warning they give is not to see crack as this all-powerful substance that makes change impossible. Yes, its effects on thoughts, feelings, behavior are strong motivators to use, but that implies there must be equally strong personal reasons to change.
Right. It's not insurmountable. They use a parable here, too, the hole in the road,
Yeah, that classic one about falling in the hole, learning to walk around it, then finally walking down a different street. They adapt it to the crack user's journey.
highlighting that cycle of relapse even with negative consequences and introducing triggers.
Exactly. It shows how heartbreaking those patterns is. And again, the stress motivation isn't just about the user. What motivates the professional? The service. If those motivations clash, you won't get far.
Okay. Then this idea of cognitive resonance, like noticing babies when you're expecting.
Yeah. It's about how we suddenly become aware of things once they connect to something core, something personally significant in our lives.
So the insight for us is, how do we help users connect the idea of change to something that deeply resonates with them? Find that core factor.
Precisely. Can we help them find something resonant enough to make them pause before using? It's posed as a question.
Interesting. And the toilet flushing syndrome, that's quite a name.
Huh, yeah. It's their analogy for why the high diminishes during a binge. Adrenaline plus dopamine plus serotonin.
Okay.
The first hit is like flushing a full cistern, big rush of dopamine. But keep flushing quickly, using repeatedly, without letting the cistern refill. Neurotransmitters replenish.
The flush gets weaker. The high gets less intense.
Exactly. Chasing that first high is physiologically impossible after a point. Understanding that can be powerful for the user.
Right. Okay, chapter 5, cravings, the driving force.
They say the most obvious reason people use is simple. They love the high, the buzz.
And all the justifications: escape, confidence, socializing, creativity, boredom.
They all link back to wanting that buzz, essentially. And they stress our job is to really explore those justifications with the user, not just accept them.
Understand the why behind the why. And they distinguish between blatant and silent cravings.
Hmm. Blatant is when you know you want it, you plan for it. Silent cravings are sneakier. They operate under the radar, often leading to those out-of-the-blue relapses.
And our role is to help make those silent cravings, well, less silent, using that blind window idea again.
Exactly. They tell Paul's story, relapsed after 3 months, seemingly triggered by just watching football and having a drink.
Yeah.
Ordinary things.
Wow. It shows how subtle triggers can be.
Absolutely. And the book stresses cravings are normal. The key is for the user to understand their specific vulnerabilities, to research the enemy, the craving, and develop personal coping strategies.
And crucially, remembering that cravings do pass unless you make the conscious choice to use.
Yes. And they mention euphoric recall too, remembering the good times, forgetting the bad, which fuels cravings.
Okay. Chapter 6 looks at reasons versus justifications. Professionals often hear justifications as just excuses, right?
Yeah, and that's a danger zone. The authors warn against us jumping to conclusions based on our own stuff, training, beliefs, experiences, instead of just asking questions and listening.
Our attitude really shapes the interaction then, whether we support or collude.
Definitely. And they use boredom as a case study, such a common reason given for relapse.
Right. And the typical response is to try and fill the user's time, keep them busy.
But the book questions that. Does that just legitimize using when bored? Does it distract from the real issue, which is often the craving underneath?
So John's story, the breakthrough came when a new worker simply asked, "What does boredom mean to you?"
Yeah. And it turned out his boredom was really masking cravings. And maybe the service, by constantly finding activities, was unintentionally playing along with his justification.
So the conclusion is, boredom itself isn't a reason to use. Asking what it means can dismantle that excuse.
Powerful stuff. Get to the root cause.
Okay, chapter 7, trust, absolutely fundamental. They suggest 4 stages.
Predictability, reliability, faith, and expose vulnerabilities.
Okay, predictability is knowing what to expect. Reliability is people doing what you expect. Faith is believing even without proof. And exposed vulnerabilities is feeling safe enough to be weak.
That's the gist. And the crucial question they pose for us is, do crack cocaine users actually trust the service? Trust us professionals. Trust our ability to focus on what really matters to them.
Big question. And this chapter also tackles some myths.
Yeah, those well-intentioned but potentially harmful beliefs, like automatically linking crack use to severe mental illness, or assuming contact only happens via the justice system, or over-relying on brain-based explanations.
Right. And they push for emotional intelligence as a key tool.
Hugely important. Self-knowledge, empathy, responsibility, communication, conflict resolution. They say emotional maturity is vital for good service development.
Makes sense. Chapter 8 is about diversity, often a tricky subject.
Yeah, they note it can be trivialized out of fear or discomfort, but they give important historical context.
About how crack emerged differently in the U.S. Affluent groups first with free base, then poor minority communities with crack, facing vastly different consequences.
Exactly. It shows how perceptions of the user dramatically affect treatment and societal views. It's not just about the drug.
So important to remember that history, and they distinguish between policy and practice.
Right. Equality of opportunity might be policy, but managing diversity needs individual and team willingness to self-reflect, challenge biases. They bring in cognitive dissonance.
That idea of justifying negative beliefs about a group to feel okay about them.
Yeah, drawing on Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary's work, and they offer a framework for thinking about diversity dimensions. Personality, internal, external, and adding history culture.
Showing just how complex it is when all these individual layers intersect in a team or service.
And the takeaway. Diversity work starts with self-awareness and the will to change.
Got it. Chapter 9, congruence. Being in sync, basically.
Harmony, agreement. And the opposite, incongruence, they talk about leaking.
Leaking.
Yeah, when your nonverbal cues give away your true feelings because what you're saying isn't totally honest or aligned.
Yeah.
It's really destructive to communication.
So honesty delivered respectfully is key to stop the leaking.
Crucial. They quote Carl Rogers a lot here. His emphasis on the therapist being genuine, transparent, authentic.
Even expressing their own feelings in the relationship, that takes guts. And self-awareness.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
And they stress that users often know how we really feel, regardless of our words. They pick up on the nonverbals.
Which brings us to NVC, nonverbal communication, body language, tone of voice.
Paralanguage, yeah.
Yeah.
The intonation, pauses. They say it's incredibly hard to fade consistently and often reveals more than words. They ask why we sometimes neglect NVC in this field when others, like law enforcement, take it so seriously.
Good question. And they give examples like how where you put the stress in a sentence changes the meaning.
Totally. And the voice itself reveals so much, even the difference between a real, eye-crinkling smile and a fake one.
So the bottom line here is, our NVC tells the truth about how we feel about users, challenging that idea of pure objectivity.
Pretty much, especially with all the societal baggage around crack cocaine. Incongruence, they argue, at the worker and service level is a big reason progress has been slow.
Wow. Okay. Chapter 10 tackles learning styles. No one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. They say we need to observe the individual user, figure out the best way to communicate with them, considering all those diversity factors, gender, culture, language, education, everything.
And if communication fails, the issue might be with us, how we're transmitting the info, not the user or the theory.
That's their assertion. And they introduce tools like Cold's learning styles, activist, reflector, etc., and Lazier's multiple intelligences.
The 7 intelligences. Body kinesthetic, interpersonal, logical, musical, all those.
Yeah, just frameworks to help us think more inclusively, learn from other fields like education, and communicate better.
Makes sense. Chapter 11 looks at the language we use. Words like addict, junkie, clean.
They question how helpful that language really is, how we learn it, perpetuate it, and how it impacts the user's self-image and the whole relationship.
Right. And persuasive language comes up. It can be used for good or ill.
Exactly. Our views of users are shaped by more than just facts. They define infer versus conclude, warning us not to jump to conclusions that block good service.
And they list the components: empathy, rhetorical questions, metaphors.
Rule of 3, adjectives, imagery, semantic fields, direct interactions, inclusive tones, pronouns, a whole toolkit.
And they use Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech as an example of powerful, persuasive language.
Yeah, and contrast it with how news articles about crack might use language to shape negative perceptions.
So understanding this helps us be mindful of our own language, guide our teams, and maybe even help users change their internal self-talk.
That's the goal. Language is powerful.
Okay, Chapter 12 quickly surveys some therapeutic models.
Yeah, 12 steps: psychodynamic, supportive, expressive, interpersonal. Noting psychotherapy is often used for stimulant issues, and stressing clear, honest education for users.
But they focus mainly on MI and CBT.
Motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy, yeah. MI for exploring ambivalence, using the stages of change model. CBT for identifying triggers, using tools like functional analysis.
And relapse prevention gets a mention, and group therapy.
Relapse prevention focuses on high-risk situations, coping skills. Group therapy offers support, education, peer feedback, reduces isolation.
And they bring in learning theories, classical and operant conditioning.
Right, to show how the whole service environment shapes behavior. Pavlov's association learning, Skinner's reinforcement and punishment, with examples related to drug use and the justice system.
Got it. So finally, chapter 13, confluence, bringing it all together.
Exactly. Like rivers joining. It's a metaphor for creating a high-quality, holistic
Mm.
service, bringing together teamwork, multidisciplinary work, diversity, all those things we talk about, but sometimes struggle to do.
So confluence is the endpoint of the discussion, emphasizing interpersonal skills, engagement, rapport, relationships.
Yes. And critiquing complacency, lack of imagination, where sometimes evidence-based can overshadow common sense, individuality, creativity. Services need to tap into their own resources to integrate everything.
They mention a diagram showing things like nutrition and the counseling environment coming together.
Yeah, and an analogy to pharmacokinetics again. Absorption, distribution, treatment, metabolism, excretion. Good treatment needs all stages to work well for the best outcome.
Like the user needing counseling, nutrition advice, health info, comfort, consistent messages, clear boundaries, integrating all those pieces.
Right, and they note how often tasks just roll over in care plans, unfinished, and the user gets blamed.
Hmm. And the painting metaphor, mixing red and blue to make purple.
Beautiful illustration, isn't it? Purple is the great service, created when the user, professional, team, environment all work together harmoniously,
Mm.
but it requires sacrifice, discernment, like a painter using resources wisely.
Nice. So the conclusion of the book acknowledges the complexities, the past flaws.
Yeah, despite good intentions. And it offers itself as maybe some new equipment, new maps, new landmarks for a more hopeful journey for everyone involved, users, professionals, services, hoping to open doors for more questions, more discussion.
Towards building a service to be proud of. Okay, so bringing this deep dive to a close, let's just quickly recap the key takeaways for you, the listener.
Mm.
We've seen how vital it is to prioritize real engagement, not just pharmacology. The importance of self-awareness for professionals and services, using tools like the Johari window.
Understanding the complexities of resistance and motivation, recognizing the huge power of language, both spoken and unspoken.
The need for diverse, inclusive learning approaches, and this idea of confluence, bringing everything together harmoniously.
Yeah, absolutely.
We really hope this discussion has maybe challenged some assumptions, offered a richer understanding of the dynamics. Maybe think about those questions the authors raised.
How do our biases shape interactions? Are we truly listening beneath the justifications? How can we build more trust, create truly effective services?
Exactly, and this is just scratching the surface, really.
Oh, for sure. The book itself goes much deeper. We'd encourage listeners to explore things like the Johari window, MI-CBT, the impact of language and diversity further. These ideas apply way beyond just substance use, too.
Definitely. Anywhere human behavior and communication matter. So one final thought to leave you with, something provocative.
Yeah.
Given that assertion from the authors that primary crack cocaine users can be the easiest clients if we address our own stuff, what fundamental shifts in training and perspective and service culture might actually be needed to unlock that potential and get much better outcomes?